The Japanese Type 93 torpedo could sink a cruiser from 11 nautical miles away, 3 times farther than any American weapon could reach. Yet the US Navy had no idea it existed until Japanese destroyers turned their own cruisers into flaming wrecks in the darkness off Guadalcanal. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The weapon that would terrorize the Pacific for nearly 2 years began not with a flash of inspiration, but with a fundamental mathematical problem that Japanese naval strategists could not ignore. In the conference rooms of Tokyo in the 1920s, as the Washington Naval Treaty carved the future of global sea power into ratios and tonnage limits, Imperial Japanese Navy planners faced a stark reality written in numbers. The treaty restricted Japan to a 5-3-5 ratio against Britain and America. For every 5 capital ships the Western powers could build, Japan could construct only 3. The disparity was intentional, designed to maintain Anglo-American supremacy in the Pacific. But numbers on paper, Japanese officers understood, did not have to translate to outcomes at sea. This was the crucible in which the Type 93 torpedo was conceived, not as merely another weapon, but as a force multiplier that could compensate for inferior numbers through superior technology and tactics. If Japanese destroyers and cruisers could strike from distances the Americans could not even imagine, if they could launch attacks before enemy ships knew they were under threat, then the mathematical disadvantage imposed by treaty limitations might be overcome. The concept was elegant in its logic. Reality would prove far more complex. 1. Japan's naval establishment in the interwar years possessed something that many Western observers failed to recognize: a sophisticated understanding of modern weapon systems and an engineering culture willing to pursue innovations that others deemed too dangerous or impractical. The Imperial Japanese Navy had studied carefully the lessons of World War I, particularly the role of torpedoes in the Battle of Jutland and in submarine warfare. They recognized that the standard compressed air torpedo, which all major navies employed, suffered from inherent limitations. The nitrogen in compressed air contributed nothing to combustion but took up substantial volume and weight. It also produced a distinctive wake of bubbles that advertised the torpedo's track across the water, giving targets precious seconds to evade. The theoretical solution had been understood for years: use pure oxygen instead of air. Oxygen would burn fuel more efficiently, produce more energy for a given volume, leave virtually no wake, and allow for either greater range or higher speed or both. But pure oxygen, compressed and mixed with fuel, was extraordinarily volatile. Several Western navies had explored oxygen torpedoes in the 1920s and abandoned the projects after accidents killed researchers and destroyed test facilities. The British Admiralty concluded the technology was too dangerous to pursue. The US Navy agreed. The conventional wisdom held that oxygen torpedoes were a laboratory curiosity, not a practical weapon. The Japanese Naval Technical Department at Kure Naval Arsenal disagreed. In 1926, Lieutenant Commander Kaniji Kishimoto, a specialist in propulsion systems, began systematic research into oxygen-enriched combustion for torpedoes. The project was classified at the highest level. Not only would the resulting weapon provide a tactical advantage, but secrecy would deny potential enemies the knowledge that such a weapon was even possible. For the next 7 years, Kishimoto and his team worked in isolation, solving one technical challenge after another. 2. The first obstacle was preventing spontaneous combustion or explosion. Pure oxygen under pressure could ignite with almost any contaminant, the trace of oil, a microscopic particle of rust, even certain metal alloys. The engineers at Kure Naval Arsenal spent months testing materials, conducting failure analysis on components that exploded during trials, studying the chemistry of oxygen reactions under various temperature and pressure conditions. They developed specialized valves made from bronze alloys carefully selected for compatibility with pure oxygen. Piping systems were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, then cleaned using processes that removed every trace of organic material. The starting system that emerged from this research was ingenious in its complexity. When a torpedo launch was initiated, compressed air would flow into the combustion chamber and begin driving the engine at low power. Temperature and pressure sensors monitored conditions continuously. Once the engine reached stable operating temperature, approximately 200 degrees Celsius, a series of valves would open incrementally, introducing pure oxygen into the air stream. The mixture would gradually shift from 21% oxygen to 30%, 50%, 70%, and finally to pure oxygen. This transition took approximately 30 seconds, during which the torpedo would already be running toward its target. If any sensor detected abnormal conditions, the system would automatically revert to compressed air operation, sacrificing performance for safety. Fuel selection required equally painstaking research. The engineers tested alcohol, gasoline, diesel, and various grades of kerosene. Each fuel burned differently with oxygen, producing different amounts of energy, different combustion temperatures, and different exhaust products. Alcohol burned too hot, causing engine components to fail. Gasoline was too volatile, risking explosion during the gradual oxygen introduction. Diesel produced excessive carbon deposits that clogged the combustion chamber. Kerosene, specifically a refined grade with minimal impurities. 3. Provided the optimal balance. It burned cleanly with oxygen, generated sufficient energy to drive the turbine at high speed, and remained stable under the varying pressures and temperatures the engine would experience during a combat run. The engine itself was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering that represented years of development and testing. Rather than the reciprocating piston engines used in many torpedoes, which were heavy and produced vibration, the Type 93 employed a wet heater system that generated steam to drive a turbine. In the combustion chamber, kerosene sprayed through atomizing nozzles mixed with pure oxygen. The resulting combustion generated temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. This extreme heat instantly converted seawater, injected into the combustion chamber through a separate system, into superheated steam at tremendous pressure. The steam drove a multi-stage turbine that rotated at speeds exceeding 5,000 revolutions per minute. The turbine shaft connected through a reduction gear to twin counter-rotating propellers. These propellers were themselves technological achievements, manufactured from manganese bronze alloy and shaped with blades angled precisely to maximize thrust while minimizing cavitation. Cavitation, the formation of vapor bubbles in water, produces noise and reduces propeller efficiency. The Type 93's propellers were designed to operate just below the cavitation threshold even at 48 knots, making the torpedo's approach remarkably quiet. Exhaust handling presented yet another engineering challenge. Conventional compressed air torpedoes vented their exhaust directly into the water, producing a highly visible wake of bubbles that trailed behind the weapon and advertised its position. The Type 93's engineers devised an exhaust system that collected the spent gases and water vapor, cooled them, and released them through ports positioned to create a dispersed cloud beneath the surface rather than a concentrated trail. The result was 4. A torpedo that left virtually no visible wake, even in daylight. In night combat, with lookouts straining to see any hint of an approaching threat, this invisibility was invaluable. By 1933, the weapon designated Type 93 Model 1 was ready for sea trials. It measured 29.5 feet in length, 2 feet in diameter, and weighed 6,100 pounds. The warhead contained 1,080 pounds of Type 97 explosive, a composition roughly 60% TNT. Performance exceeded every prediction. At a setting of 36 knots, the torpedo could reach 40,000 yards, 22 nautical miles. At 48 knots, it could strike targets 22,000 yards away, still more than 11 nautical miles. These ranges were so extraordinary that even Japanese officers initially doubted them. A torpedo launched from one ship could hit another ship beyond the visual horizon. The implications were staggering. Compare this to the American Mark 15 torpedo, the standard surface ship weapon when war came to the Pacific. The Mark 15 was 21 inches in diameter, weighed 3,841 pounds including its 494-pound Torpex warhead, and measured 24 feet in length. Its propulsion came from a wet heater engine burning alcohol with compressed air. At maximum range, 15,000 yards or about 8 nautical miles, it crawled at 26.5 knots, a speed that many destroyers and all cruisers could exceed. At its high-speed setting of 45 knots, theoretically fast enough to catch most targets, it could reach only 6,000 yards, barely more than 3 nautical miles. Moreover, the Mark 15 left a conspicuous wake of bubbles that alerted targets to its approach. The performance gap was staggering. The Type 93 at 48 knots, faster than the Mark 15's top speed, could reach 22,000 yards, nearly 4 times the American weapon's high-speed range. At moderate speed settings, the disparity was even more pronounced. A Type 93 set to 36 knots, still faster than many warships could sustain, could reach 40,000 yards, or approximately 22 nautical miles. This was beyond visual range even in perfect daylight conditions, and far beyond the range at which night combat usually occurred. From a targeting perspective, this range advantage revolutionized night surface tactics. An American destroyer commander in 1942, planning a torpedo attack, would think in terms of closing to 5,000 to 8,000 yards, close enough for visual targeting, close enough to ensure his torpedoes would reach the target before it could evade. A Japanese destroyer commander could begin his attack at 12,000 to 15,000 yards, launching torpedoes from positions where the enemy did not even consider torpedo attack possible. By the time American lookouts spotted the Japanese ships, if they spotted them at all, torpedoes would already be running through the water, and evading them became a matter of luck rather than skill. The warhead carried by the Type 93 also exceeded American weapons. At 1,080 pounds of Type 97 explosive, a composition roughly 60% TNT, 40% other compounds that enhanced explosive power, the long lance packed more than twice the punch of the Mark 15. A single Type 93 hit could break a destroyer's keel, flooding multiple compartments and causing the ship to sink within minutes. A hit on a cruiser might not sink the vessel immediately, but would almost certainly cripple her, knocking out power, flooding magazines and machinery spaces, and causing fires that could consume the ship if damage control failed. The operational doctrine built around the long lance, the name American sailors would later give it, mistakenly believing it was the weapon's official designation, reflected Japanese tactical philosophy for night combat that had been developed systematically over more than a decade. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily in night fighting capabilities throughout the 1930s, recognizing that in any future war with the United States, Japan's numerical disadvantage would require tactical innovations that could offset American superiority in numbers and 6. Industrial capacity. Night combat offered such an opportunity. Darkness neutralized many American advantages, superior radar fire control would not arrive until later, and sheer weight of metal meant less when visual acquisition became the limiting factor. Officers and crews drilled endlessly in night maneuvers. Destroyer and cruiser divisions conducted monthly exercises in complete darkness, practicing formation keeping, course changes, and simulated torpedo attacks without lights or radio communication. These exercises were demanding and sometimes resulted in collisions, but they produced crews with exceptional skill in operating at night. The training regimen extended to individual sailors as well. Lookouts, critical personnel in night combat, underwent specialized selection and training. Candidates were tested for natural night vision acuity, and those who scored highest were assigned to lookout duties and given additional training. The training included dietary regulations designed to maximize night vision. Japanese naval nutritionists, aware of vitamin A's role in maintaining healthy vision, ensured that lookouts received rations rich in the vitamin. They also received preferential access to fresh vegetables and liver, both excellent vitamin A sources. Before night operations, lookouts would spend extended periods, sometimes an hour or more, in darkened compartments, allowing their eyes to fully adapt to low-light conditions. Once on watch, they used red-filtered lights for any necessary illumination, preserving night vision that white lights would destroy. Japanese optical manufacturers, particularly Nippon Kogaku, which would later become Nikon, produced binoculars and rangefinders of exceptional quality. The standard Type 96 binoculars issued to Japanese warships had 15x magnification and 60mm objective lenses, larger than most American equivalents. The larger objective lenses gathered more light, providing brighter, clearer images in low-light conditions. Lens coatings, applied using proprietary processes developed in the 1930s, reduced internal 7. reflections and increased light transmission. The result was optical equipment that gave Japanese lookouts a measurable advantage in detecting targets in darkness. More importantly, the Japanese developed a coherent tactical system for night surface combat that integrated technology, training, and doctrine into a unified operational method. The system emphasized stealth and surprise over firepower, recognizing that the first strike in night combat often proved decisive. Ships would approach at moderate speed, typically 15 to 20 knots, to minimize wake and noise. Higher speeds created bow waves and stern wakes that could be visible even at considerable distances. Engines and boilers would be managed carefully to avoid excessive smoke, which could betray position. Lookouts and fire control personnel relied on visual observation rather than radio communication. Radio traffic, even in code, could be intercepted and direction-finding equipment could locate the source. Japanese doctrine called for radio silence to be maintained as long as possible, with signals passed by shaded signal lamps or hand signals. This imposed demands on crew training and coordination but provided security that radio communication could not match. Once the enemy was located, typically through lookout reports or, later in the war, through primitive radar, destroyers would maneuver into attack position and launch torpedo spreads from maximum range. The doctrine specified ranges of 10,000 to 15,000 yards for night attacks, distances that would have seemed suicidal to American or British destroyer commanders but which the Type 93's performance made entirely feasible. Destroyers would launch their torpedoes, then turn away before the enemy could react, presenting a minimal target profile. The turn-away maneuver also positioned destroyers to reload torpedo tubes, a time-consuming process that required the ship to be steady on course, while opening range from the enemy. 8. Cruisers would follow up with gunfire only after torpedoes had struck home and thrown the enemy formation into chaos. This sequencing was deliberate. Gunfire produced muzzle flashes that destroyed night vision and advertised the firing ship's position. By waiting until after torpedo hits, Japanese cruisers ensured that the enemy would be disorganized, possibly with ships damaged or sinking, before gun action commenced. The initial confusion created by torpedo hits would compound as gunfire began, making coordinated enemy response nearly impossible. The entire system depended on careful coordination, crew discipline, and weapons that could reliably hit targets at extreme range. The Type 93 provided the weapon. Japanese training provided the discipline and coordination. When all three elements came together, as they did repeatedly in late 1942, the results were devastating. Throughout the late 1930s, as tensions escalated between Japan and the United States, the Type 93 was produced in substantial numbers. Approximately 2,600 torpedoes were manufactured, with about 1,350 available when the Pacific War began in December 1941. Each torpedo required an oxygen generation system aboard ship, a complex piece of equipment that separated oxygen from air through compression and cooling, then stored it in specialized tanks. Not all Japanese warships received this equipment immediately, but by 1941, most frontline cruisers and destroyers of the combined fleet had the capability to employ oxygen torpedoes. The first large-scale use of the Type 93 came on the night of August 8 to 9, 1942, in the waters between Florida Island and Savo Island, northwest of Guadalcanal. The United States had just launched Operation Watchtower, the first major American offensive in the Pacific, seizing the strategically vital airfield the Japanese were constructing on Guadalcanal. Allied cruisers and destroyers screened the invasion fleet, anticipating a Japanese response but confident in their numerical superiority and recent installation of radar on several ships. 9. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commanded the Japanese reaction force, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer, racing south from Rabaul to strike the invasion fleet before it could consolidate. Mikawa's force entered the Sound in single column shortly after midnight, lookouts straining to identify targets in the darkness. At approximately 0130 hours on August 9, Japanese lookouts spotted the southern screening group, the heavy cruisers HMAS Canberra and USS Chicago, with destroyers Patterson and Bagley. What happened in the next hour would be dissected by naval historians for decades, studied in war colleges as a case study in both tactical excellence and catastrophic failure. Mikawa's formation approached in single column at 24 knots, ships maintaining precise station on each other, lookouts and fire control personnel scanning the darkness. At approximately 0136 on August 9, lookouts on the flagship Chokai reported warship silhouettes to port, the Southern Allied screening group. Mikawa's force executed the attack drill they had practiced countless times. Cruisers calculated firing solutions based on visual range estimates and target aspect angles. At ranges between 10,000 and 12,000 yards, distances at which American commanders would never have considered launching torpedoes, Japanese cruisers began firing Type 93s. The heavy cruiser Chokai fired 8 torpedoes. Aoba fired 4. Kako fired 4. Kinagasa fired 4. Furutaka fired 4. In the space of approximately 2 minutes, 24 long-lance torpedoes entered the water and began their runs toward the Allied cruisers. The torpedoes ran true and silent through the black water. At 48 knots, they would reach their targets in approximately 5 to 6 minutes. During that interval, Mikawa's ships continued their approach, closing the range for the gun action that would follow the torpedo attack. American radar operators on Chicago detected contacts but initially assessed them as friendly aircraft. The SC air search radar could detect ships but could not accurately determine range or bearing. The newer SG surface search 10 radar, which might have provided better information, was not yet installed on ships of the Southern Group. Visual lookouts scanned the darkness but saw nothing. The Japanese ships were still hull down beyond effective visual range. At approximately 0142, the first torpedoes began striking home. HMAS Canberra, flagship of the Southern Group, took 2 Type 93 hits on her starboard side within seconds. The first torpedo struck just aft of the forward fire room, tearing open a massive hole in her hull below the waterline. The second hit further aft, rupturing additional compartments. Both boiler rooms flooded immediately, cutting all steam to the turbines. Canberra went dead in the water, powerless, unable to maneuver or fight effectively. Fires erupted from ruptured fuel lines and spread rapidly. Seconds later, USS Chicago took a torpedo hit that struck her starboard bow. The explosion was tremendous, severing the bow completely and blowing it into the water. By extraordinary fortune, the hit occurred forward of all critical machinery and magazines. Chicago's engines continued to run, and she retained her fighting capability despite the catastrophic damage. Her commanding officer, Captain Howard Bode, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. He turned Chicago away from the action and headed west, ostensibly to pursue what he believed was a Japanese destroyer. In reality, he withdrew from a battle that was just beginning. Only then did Japanese searchlights blaze to life, illuminating targets for follow-up gunfire. The sudden brilliance after total darkness was blinding. American gun crews, struggling to adjust, fired back but could not achieve effective fire control. Japanese gunners, trained extensively for this exact scenario, poured shells into Canberra. Within minutes, the Australian cruiser was a burning wreck, her casualties mounting, her survival in doubt. 11. The first torpedoes struck before most American ships even knew they were under attack. Canberra took 2 Type 93 hits on her starboard side within seconds. The explosions tore open her hull below the waterline, flooding machinery spaces and cutting power. She went dead in the water, unable to fight or maneuver. Chicago took a torpedo hit that blew off her bow but miraculously remained operational. Patterson and Bagley escaped, but the Southern Group was effectively destroyed as a fighting force within 10 minutes. Mikawa's column then turned north, approaching the Northern Screening Group, heavy cruisers Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, with destroyers Helm and Wilson. The American cruisers were completely unaware that a battle was already underway to the south. The sound of gunfire had been heard, but in the confusion of the night, the meaning was unclear. Some officers thought it might be a shore bombardment or an engagement with Japanese aircraft. No one anticipated that enemy cruisers had penetrated the screening force and were now approaching from a totally unexpected direction. At approximately 0150, Japanese lookouts on Mikawa's flagship Chokai identified the Northern Group cruisers. Again the Japanese executed their doctrine precisely. Cruisers calculated firing solutions and launched torpedoes at ranges between 8,000 and 10,000 yards. Chokai fired 8 Type 93s. Aoba fired 4. Kako fired 4. Kinagasa fired 4. In the space of 3 minutes, 20 long-lance torpedoes entered the water, aimed at the Northern Group. Vincennes, flagship of the Northern Group under Captain Frederick Riefkohl, was the first to detect the threat. A lookout reported ships to the south at approximately 0150. Before Riefkohl could react, Japanese searchlights illuminated his ship. Gunfire followed within seconds. Vincennes' crew rushed to battle stations, but they were already fatally behind the action timeline. At 0153, a Type 93 torpedo struck Vincennes on her port side, near the forward fire room. The explosion opened a 12 massive hole and flooded critical compartments. 2 minutes later, a second torpedo hit further aft. Shell hits rained down simultaneously. Vincennes would be struck by more than 70 shells before the action ended. Fires consumed the bridge and spread to the hangar deck. At 0200, power failed completely. Vincennes began listing heavily. Captain Riefkohl gave the order to abandon ship at 0230. She capsized and sank at 0250, taking 332 officers and men with her. Quincy, commanded by Captain Samuel Moore, also came under sudden, overwhelming attack. She took a torpedo hit at approximately 0155, followed rapidly by a second. Shells struck her bridge, killing Captain Moore and most of his senior officers within the first few minutes of action. With her command structure destroyed, Quincy's response became disorganized. More torpedo hits followed, estimates range from 3 to 5 total. The ship was struck by more than 50 shells, many hitting at point-blank range as Japanese cruisers closed to 3,000 yards or less. Quincy's magazine exploded at 0216. She sank at 0238, taking more than 370 men down with her, including her captain. Astoria, under Captain William Greenman, fared marginally better initially. Her crew had time to man battle stations before torpedoes struck. She took at least one Type 93 hit, possibly two, along with dozens of shell hits that started major fires. Her damage control teams fought heroically throughout the early morning hours, containing flooding and battling fires. But the damage was simply too severe. By dawn, with fires spreading and flooding worsening, Captain Greenman made the difficult decision to abandon ship. Astoria finally sank at 12:15 on August 9, after burning for more than 10 hours. 116 men died on Astoria, but her crew saved more than 700. 13. Canberra, too damaged to save and barely afloat, was scuttled by American destroyers later on August 9. The destroyer USS Ellet fired more than 260 rounds of 5-inch shells into the crippled cruiser before she finally sank. Even in her death throes, the heavy cruiser's construction proved robust. In slightly more than an hour, Mikawa's force had sunk or mortally wounded 4 heavy cruisers and damaged a 5th, killing more than 1,000 Allied sailors and wounding hundreds more. Japanese losses: moderate damage to 3 cruisers, 37 men killed, 57 wounded. The Battle of Savo Island remains one of the most lopsided defeats in U.S. Navy history. The exchange rate, for heavy cruisers and more than 1,000 men for 37 Japanese casualties, was almost inconceivable. American commanders initially could not comprehend what had happened. The rapidity and violence of the attack, the fact that ships had been torpedoed from distances they thought impossible, the complete tactical surprise despite having radar, left survivors struggling to explain the disaster. The subsequent inquiry would identify numerous failures in command, communications, and doctrine, but the fundamental reality remained: Japanese forces had executed a near-perfect night torpedo attack using a weapon American forces did not even know existed. Only later, as American intelligence pieced together Japanese communications intercepts and interrogated prisoners, did the truth emerge: Japan possessed a torpedo unlike anything the Allies had anticipated. Still later, when salvage divers examined the wrecks and recovered fragments, engineers realized the weapon used pure oxygen combustion. But understanding what had hit them did not immediately provide a solution. The Type 93 continued to dominate night surface actions throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. At the Battle of Cape Esperance on October 11 to 12, 1942, American cruisers achieved surprise and inflicted damage on a Japanese force, but long-lance torpedoes struck back, hitting the 14 destroyer Duncan and contributing to her loss. At the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal on November 12 to 15, Japanese destroyers and cruisers launched dozens of Type 93s in the confused night actions that raged across Iron Bottom Sound. The destroyer USS Preston took multiple torpedo hits and sank rapidly. Destroyers Walk and Benham were both crippled by long-lance hits and later scuttled. But the most devastating demonstration of the Type 93's effectiveness came on the night of November 30, 1942, at the Battle of Tassafaronga. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, one of the finest destroyer commanders in the Imperial Japanese Navy, led 8 destroyers on a supply run to Guadalcanal. They carried drums filled with food and ammunition to be dropped overboard and retrieved by troops ashore, a desperate measure reflecting Japan's deteriorating logistical situation. Tanaka knew American cruisers patrolled these waters and expected contact. Rear Admiral Carlton Wright commanded the American force, for heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 6 destroyers. His flagship Minneapolis and several other ships carried the new SG surface search radar, which could detect targets at over 20 miles. Wright had every advantage: superior numbers, radar that could see in the darkness, and intelligence that the Japanese were coming. He planned to ambush them. At 23:06, Minneapolis's SG radar detected Tanaka's destroyers at 23,000 yards. The American formation maneuvered into attack position. Destroyer Fletcher, equipped with radar, tracked for Japanese destroyers at 7,000 yards and requested permission to launch torpedoes. Wright delayed his approval, wanting to close the range further. 2 minutes passed. The target angle worsened as the Japanese destroyers crossed ahead of the American column. At 23:20, Wright finally gave the order. Fletcher fired 10 torpedoes, Perkins 8. Before those American torpedoes could reach their targets, Wright ordered the cruisers to open fire. 15. The Japanese response demonstrated the doctrine and discipline that made them so effective in night combat. The nearest destroyer, Takanami, found herself under concentrated fire from all 5 American cruisers. She launched her torpedoes even as shells tore her apart, then fought with guns until she sank. But her sacrifice bought time. The remaining 7 destroyers, following Tanaka's doctrine exactly, refrained from returning fire. They did not increase speed or create visible wakes. Calmly and precisely, maintaining formation, they reversed course and paralleled the American cruisers at approximately 8,000 yards. Between 23:23 and 23:33, 6 destroyers launched 44 Type 93 torpedoes in one of the most devastating surface torpedo attacks ever conducted. The long lances ran through the darkness at 48 knots, approaching targets that had no idea they were coming. Each torpedo tracked its preset course with mechanical precision. The gyroscope in each weapon's guidance section maintained bearing to within a fraction of a degree. Depth-keeping mechanisms held the torpedoes at their preset running depth, typically 8 to 10 feet below the surface, deep enough to avoid detection but shallow enough to strike targets above the waterline. The kerosene-oxygen engines purred smoothly, generating the thrust that propelled 3 tons of steel and explosive through the water at speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour. American radar could detect ships but not torpedoes in the water. The radar cross-section of a torpedo, less than 2 feet in diameter, running just below the surface, was far too small for the radar sets of 1942 to detect. Visual lookouts saw nothing. The torpedoes left no wakes, produced no sound loud enough to carry over the ambient noise of ships underway and guns firing. Fire control personnel were blinded by their own gun flashes and the blazing pyre of Takanami, which burned with fierce intensity after absorbing hits from all 5 American cruisers. The light from the burning destroyer destroyed the night vision of every man looking in that direction, leaving them unable to see anything in the darkness beyond. 16. The American cruisers steamed in column, each ship following the one ahead at intervals of approximately 600 yards. From a torpedo targeting perspective, it was a nearly perfect setup. Ships in column present their full length as a target to torpedoes launched from the beam. A spread of torpedoes, multiple weapons launched at slightly different bearings, creates a moving wall of explosives. If the target maneuvers to avoid one torpedo, it may steer directly into the path of another. Japanese torpedo doctrine emphasized spread firing for precisely this reason. At 23:27, flagship Minneapolis took 2 torpedo hits. One blew off her entire bow, which dragged alongside the ship like a grotesque metal banner. The second struck Fire Room No. 2, killing 33 men instantly as seawater flooded boiler spaces. Minneapolis shuddered to a halt, out of power, out of action, struggling simply to stay afloat. Her skipper, Captain Charles E. Rosendahl, would spend the next hours fighting to save his ship, a battle he would ultimately win, earning a Navy Cross. New Orleans, steaming in column behind Minneapolis, tried to avoid the crippled flagship. At that moment, a Type 93 struck her port bow. The torpedo detonated bomb storage spaces adjacent to the impact point. The resulting secondary explosion severed the cruiser completely, everything forward of turret No. 2 separating from the ship in one catastrophic instant. The bow section, including turret 2 and everyone inside, sank immediately. Flaming oil from ruptured fuel tanks swept over the remaining hull. The executive officer countermanded the captain's abandon ship order and organized damage control parties that ultimately saved the ship. New Orleans lost 183 men. She would eventually reach Australia sailing stern first, one of the most dramatic images of the Pacific War. Pensacola, attempting to pass the burning wrecks ahead, silhouetted herself against the flames and took a long lance hit beneath her mainmast. The explosion ignited massive fires and caused severe flooding. 17. Ammunition in turret No. 3 began cooking off in the heat, detonating round after round. Her crew fought desperately to save her. 125 men died, but Pensacola survived. Light cruiser Honolulu managed to evade the torpedo spread, but heavy cruiser Northampton, bringing up the rear, could not. 2 Type 93 torpedoes struck her in rapid succession. Damage control teams struggled for hours to save the ship, but the flooding could not be contained. Shortly before 0300 on December 1, Northampton rolled over and sank. 50 men went down with her. American destroyers, which had led the column, were too far ahead to assist when the torpedoes struck. By the time they returned, the Japanese destroyers had vanished into the night at high speed, having suffered only the loss of Takanami. For American cruisers crippled or sunk, more than 400 sailors dead in exchange for 1 Japanese destroyer. The exchange rate was so lopsided that it defied comprehension. Admiral Wright would receive a Navy Cross for the battle. So would his surviving cruiser captains. But within the Navy, Tassafaronga became a case study in tactical failure. Wright had delayed the destroyer torpedo attack at the critical moment. American torpedoes, already plagued by reliability problems, failed to score any hits. The cruisers had opened fire prematurely, alerting the enemy before torpedoes arrived. And fundamentally, American commanders still did not appreciate the range and effectiveness of the Type 93. They thought in terms of torpedo combat at 5,000 to 8,000 yards. The Japanese were thinking in terms of 10,000 to 15,000 yards or more. Yet even as the Type 93 dominated surface combat in late 1942, the circumstances that had made it so effective were beginning to shift. The primary advantage the long lance provided was range, the ability to strike targets before they could effectively respond. But this advantage, 18, depended on detection and targeting at night, which required superior optics, superior training, and superior tactical coordination. By early 1943, the balance in all these areas was changing. American radar technology improved rapidly. The SG surface search radar, which had equipped only a few ships at Tassafaronga, became standard fleet equipment. More importantly, American commanders began to understand how to use radar tactically. Instead of viewing it as simply a detection tool, they integrated it into attack doctrine. Radar-equipped destroyers would lead formations, detecting enemy ships at long range and maneuvering into favorable attack positions. Cruisers would hold fire until destroyers had launched torpedoes or until radar fire control had optimal solutions. The U.S. Navy also revised its torpedo tactics. American destroyers began launching at longer ranges, accepting lower hit probabilities in exchange for getting torpedoes into the water before enemy forces could react. More significantly, American doctrine shifted toward avoiding night surface actions altogether when possible. Instead, the Navy emphasized air superiority and daytime surface engagements where American advantages in radar fire control and sheer firepower could dominate. The nature of naval warfare in the Pacific was transforming in ways that fundamentally diminished the Type 93's impact. The period from mid-1943 onward saw the United States Navy shift its operational focus from contested surface battles to systematic maritime dominance through carrier air power and amphibious operations. Fast carrier task forces, built around the new Essex-class carriers that were entering service at a rate of 1 per month, could strike targets hundreds of miles inland and control vast expanses of ocean. Japanese surface forces that ventured within range faced swarms of dive bombers and torpedo planes that could attack from beyond the range of anti-aircraft guns. By mid-1943, Japan's strategic position in the Solomons had collapsed. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the objective that had cost so much blood to defend and 19. Attack, served as a base for American aircraft that increasingly controlled the surrounding waters in daylight. The balance of air power, which had been roughly even during the desperate fighting of late 1942, had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force squadrons based at Henderson and satellite fields could put up more than 200 aircraft on short notice. Japanese air strength at Rabaul, depleted by losses and unable to be adequately reinforced, had declined to the point where contesting American air superiority over the Solomons became impossible. This shift had profound implications for surface operations. The Tokyo Express, called by the Japanese the Rat Transportation System, a more accurate description of its desperate, harried nature, could no longer operate with the impunity it had enjoyed in late 1942. Destroyers had to time their runs to arrive at Guadalcanal after dark, unload or drop supplies, and be out of range of Henderson-based aircraft by dawn. This compressed timetable left little margin for delays or complications. When American PT boats began operating in strength around Guadalcanal in December 1942, they added another layer of threat. The PT boats were small, fast, difficult to hit with destroyer gunfire, and armed with torpedoes of their own. Though their Mark 8 torpedoes were short-ranged and unreliable, they could still inflict damage on destroyers caught in confined waters. On the night of December 11 to 12, 1942, Rear Admiral Tanaka led yet another Tokyo Express run, embarked on the destroyer Teruzuki. For American PT boats, PT-37, PT-40, PT-44, and PT-59 intercepted the Japanese formation in the darkness. In the confused action that followed, PT-37 and PT-40 both fired torpedoes at close range. One or more struck Teruzuki, inflicting severe damage. The destroyer's engine spaces flooded and she lost power. Tanaka transferred his flag to another destroyer while Teruzuki's crew fought to save their ship. They failed. Teruzuki sank. 20. Before dawn. Tanaka survived, but his flagship did not, a bitter irony for the commander whose own torpedo attacks had devastated American forces just weeks earlier. The incident encapsulated the changing nature of the naval war in the Solomons. Japanese destroyers, which had dominated night surface actions when they could choose the time and place of engagement, now found themselves operating in an environment where threats came from multiple directions: aircraft by day, PT boats by night, American cruisers and destroyers whenever they could concentrate superior force. The opportunities for the kind of major surface actions where long lances had proven so deadly became increasingly rare. And when such actions did occur, American forces now came equipped with better radar, better tactics, and better understanding of Japanese capabilities. Furthermore, Japan's overall naval strength was declining at a rate that no amount of tactical skill could compensate for. The destroyer force that had executed Tanaka's brilliant torpedo attacks at Tassafaronga was attriting steadily. In the 6 months following that battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost more than 30 destroyers to enemy action, accidents, and operational casualties. Japanese shipyards, operating at maximum capacity, could produce only 15 to 20 destroyers per year, barely half the loss rate. The numerical imbalance grew worse with each passing month. Trained crews were even harder to replace than ships. The intensive night fighting training that had made Japanese destroyer and cruiser crews so effective in 1942 required months of drilling, live-fire exercises, and operational experience. Pre-war crews had trained for years. Many officers and petty officers had a decade or more of service, with countless hours spent perfecting the skills necessary for night combat, visual target identification, range estimation, course prediction, torpedo firing. 21. Solutions. As these veterans were killed in action, drowned when their ships sank, or succumbed to disease and exhaustion, they were replaced by men with minimal training and no combat experience. By 1944, the quality gap between experienced American crews, now veterans of 2 years of combat, and newly trained Japanese crews was stark. American destroyer and cruiser crews had learned from their defeats in 1942. They understood Japanese tactics. They knew about the Long Lance and respected its capabilities. They had developed countermeasures, radar-controlled formation tactics, aggressive use of destroyers for forward screening, rapid maneuvering once torpedoes were detected. More importantly, American crews operated within a tactical system that emphasized coordination, communication, and mutual support. Japanese crews, increasingly isolated as communications degraded and command structures collapsed, often fought as individual ships rather than as coordinated formations. There was also a fundamental vulnerability built into the Type 93's design, though it would take time for this to become tactically significant. The oxygen storage and generation systems required by the torpedo were complex, expensive, and occupied substantial space aboard ship. A typical destroyer carried equipment to generate, compress, and store oxygen sufficient for multiple torpedo reloads, perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 pounds of pure oxygen under high pressure. The oxygen generation system used a compression cooling cycle to separate oxygen from air, a process that required electrical power, cooling water, and careful monitoring. The compressed oxygen was stored in banks of high-pressure cylinders, each a potential bomb if ruptured. More critically, these systems were extremely vulnerable to damage. A shell or bomb hit on a ship's oxygen storage area could trigger catastrophic secondary explosions. Pure oxygen does not burn by itself, but it makes everything else burn with terrible intensity. A fire that might be controllable in normal conditions becomes unstoppable when fed by. 22. Escaping oxygen. Several Japanese cruisers and destroyers suffered this fate when American gunfire or aerial bombs ruptured oxygen tanks, turning the Long Lance's fuel source into a weapon against the ships that carried them. The most famous example occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. The heavy cruiser Kumano, already damaged by torpedo hits from American submarines, came under attack by carrier aircraft. A bomb struck near her oxygen storage compartment. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, far more powerful than the bomb alone would have caused. Witnesses described a sheet of flame hundreds of feet high erupting from the cruiser. Her entire stern was blown apart. Somehow, through damage control efforts that bordered on miraculous, Kumano remained afloat. She limped to port but would never fight again, eventually being sunk by aircraft in November 1944. The destroyer Isokase met a more immediate fate. During an air attack in April 1945, a bomb hit ruptured her oxygen storage. The subsequent explosion literally tore the destroyer in half. She sank in less than 3 minutes, giving her crew virtually no time to abandon ship. Similar incidents occurred aboard other Japanese warships throughout 1944 and 1945. As American airpower increased and American submarines became more effective, Japanese surface ships faced growing threats that often resulted in hits on vulnerable areas. The oxygen systems that gave the Type 93 its extraordinary performance became increasingly deadly liabilities. Japanese naval architects were aware of this vulnerability but could do little to mitigate it. The oxygen had to be stored somewhere, and any location aboard ship would be exposed to enemy fire. Some ships had their oxygen storage compartments located deep in the hull, below the waterline, but this made them vulnerable to torpedo hits. Others placed oxygen storage higher in the ship, but this exposed it to shell fire and 23. Bomb hits. There was no perfect solution, and as American weapons became more powerful and numerous, the inherent vulnerability of oxygen storage became an ever greater concern. By 1944, the Type 93 was still being produced and employed, but its tactical dominance had ended. The night surface actions where it had been most effective no longer occurred. American carrier aviation controlled vast expanses of the Pacific, and surface ships that ventured out in daylight faced swarms of dive bombers and torpedo planes. Japanese destroyers and cruisers increasingly served defensive roles, escorting convoys or supporting amphibious operations, missions where the long lancer's range and speed were less relevant than simple survival. When surface actions did occur, they tended to be daylight engagements where radar-directed American gunfire simply overwhelmed Japanese formations before torpedoes could be launched effectively. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle of the war and possibly the largest naval battle in history, saw Type 93 torpedoes fired in several of the constituent actions, but their impact was marginal compared to the decisive results they had achieved 2 years earlier. At the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, Japanese Vice Admiral Tokyo Kurita's center force, including 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, encountered Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's task unit the 3rd of April, 77, known as Taffy 3, comprising 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The Japanese force had stumbled upon the escort carriers by accident and possessed overwhelming firepower superiority. This should have been a massacre. Japanese cruisers and destroyers launched more than 60 Type 93 torpedoes at the fleeing American ships during the 2.5-hour running battle that followed. Yet the results were far from the devastating torpedo attacks of 1942. The engagement occurred in daylight, robbing Japanese forces of the night combat advantages they had trained for. American ships maneuvered 24. Violently, making radical course changes, laying smoke screens, and exploiting rain squalls for concealment. Japanese fire control struggled to achieve accurate solutions on targets that zigged and zagged unpredictably. Most importantly, American destroyers and destroyer escorts counterattacked with suicidal bravery, charging the Japanese formation and forcing cruisers and destroyers to maneuver defensively, disrupting their torpedo attacks. The Type 93 torpedoes that were launched achieved only limited success. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts was hit by a long lance that failed to detonate, a perforating hit that passed through the thin hull without triggering the contact exploder. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay, already crippled by Japanese gunfire, may have taken a torpedo hit before sinking, though the extensive shell damage makes it impossible to determine what finally caused her loss. Several other ships were targeted but evaded torpedoes through aggressive maneuvering. The carefully controlled firing solutions that had worked so well at night against ships steaming in formation proved far less effective in daylight against violently maneuvering targets partially obscured by smoke. The desperate, confused nature of the battle off Samar encapsulated the changed circumstances of 1944. Japanese forces still possessed the Type 93, still knew how to use it, but no longer controlled the tactical environment that made the weapon so effective. American forces had learned how to counter Japanese torpedo tactics through hard experience. And the broader strategic situation, American air superiority, Japanese fuel shortages, the attrition of experienced crews, meant that even when Japanese surface forces achieved tactical opportunities, they often lacked the resources or training to fully exploit them. The final months of the Pacific War saw Type 93 torpedoes used primarily by the few remaining Japanese surface ships in desperate, often suicidal missions. The super battleship Yamato, on her final voyage toward Okinawa in April 1945, carried Type 93 torpedoes in her secondary 25 batteries, but she never fired them. American carrier planes sank her hours before she could reach the invasion fleet. Destroyers and cruisers that survived to the end of the war often lacked the fuel to sortie or the crews to operate effectively. The Long Lance, which had been the most advanced torpedo in the world in 1941, ended the war as a footnote, its potential never fully realized. Statistical analysis of Type 93 combat effectiveness reveals a weapon that dominated for a specific period under specific conditions, then declined rapidly as those conditions changed. In 1942, during the Guadalcanal campaign, Type 93 torpedoes sank or crippled at least 10 American and Allied cruisers and destroyers, along with numerous smaller vessels. The weapon's hit rate in night surface actions during this period approached 15 to 20%, extraordinarily high for unguided torpedoes. But in 1943, as American radar and tactics improved, the hit rate dropped to single digits. By 1944, it was negligible. This pattern reflects a broader truth about weapons technology in warfare. A weapon's effectiveness depends not only on its inherent characteristics but on the tactical and operational context in which it is employed. The Type 93 was genuinely revolutionary, a torpedo that exceeded Western weapons in range, speed, and stealth by factors of 2 or 3. But it was optimized for a specific kind of combat, night surface actions at medium to long range, that became increasingly rare as the war progressed. When the tactical environment shifted, the weapon's advantages became less relevant. There is also the question of whether the Type 93 represented the best use of Japan's limited industrial and technological resources. Developing and producing the torpedo required substantial investment in research, specialized manufacturing, and shipboard oxygen generation systems. Approximately 2,600 Type 93 torpedoes were produced during the war, along with smaller numbers of the related Type 95 submarine-launched version. The resources devoted to this program might alternatively have 26. Been invested in areas where Japan faced greater deficiencies: radar, sonar, anti-submarine warfare, or aircraft production. The Long Lance gave Japan a tactical edge in a narrow domain, night surface combat, but did not address the broader operational and strategic challenges that ultimately determined the war's outcome. Yet to dismiss the Type 93 as merely an expensive novelty would be equally wrong. In late 1942 and early 1943, when the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign hung in the balance, Japanese destroyers and cruisers equipped with Long Lance torpedoes repeatedly challenged American control of the waters around the island. They inflicted casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. They forced the U.S. Navy to revise tactics and doctrine. They demonstrated that technological innovation could partially offset numerical and industrial disadvantages. For a window of approximately 8 months, the Type 93 provided Japan with a weapon that American forces could not match and struggled to counter. The legacy of the Long Lance extends beyond its combat record into the realms of post-war weapons development, tactical doctrine, and historical understanding. After the war, American naval intelligence and weapons development personnel conducted extensive studies of captured Type 93 torpedoes. Several intact specimens were recovered from wrecked Japanese ships and naval bases. Engineers carefully disassembled the weapons, examining every component, measuring tolerances, analyzing materials, and attempting to understand the design philosophy that had produced such an effective weapon. The oxygen propulsion system received particular attention. American engineers had known theoretically that pure oxygen combustion could provide superior performance, but they had assumed the safety challenges made the technology impractical for operational weapons. The Type 93 demonstrated that those challenges could be overcome through careful engineering and rigorous manufacturing quality control. The 27. Specialized starting system that used compressed air initially, then gradually transitioned to pure oxygen, impressed American analysts as an elegant solution to the combustion stability problem. The warhead and exploder mechanism also drew study. The Type 93 used a relatively simple contact exploder, a mechanical device that detonated the warhead when the torpedo struck a solid object. This stood in stark contrast to the American Mark 14 and Mark 15 torpedoes, which had used complex magnetic influence exploders that proved catastrophically unreliable in the first 2 years of the war. Japanese engineers had opted for simplicity and reliability over theoretical advantages, and their torpedoes worked as designed. The lesson was not lost on American weapons developers. These studies influenced American torpedo development in the immediate post-war years and beyond. though the specific technologies were not directly adopted. The U.S. Navy experimented with oxygen-enriched propulsion in the late 1940s but ultimately judged the safety risks too great for the advantages provided. American submarines and surface ships would continue using electric torpedoes or conventional wet heater engines burning alcohol with compressed air. The performance gap that the Type 93 had exploited, superior range and speed, would eventually be closed through different means: electric torpedoes with improved battery technology, and ultimately guided torpedoes that traded some speed for the ability to actively home on targets. Soviet naval engineers, however, took a different lesson from Japanese torpedo technology. Soviet forces had captured Japanese installations and equipment in Manchuria and the Kuril Islands in August 1945. Among the captured materials were Type 93 torpedoes, technical documentation, and some of the engineers who had worked on the weapons development. Soviet weapons designers, already working on advanced torpedo concepts, incorporated oxygen propulsion technology into their programs. The result, years later, was the Type 65 torpedo, developed in the 1960s. 28. For Soviet submarines. The Type 65 used oxygen-enriched propulsion derived partly from Japanese research, giving it performance characteristics of approximately 50 knot speed and ranges exceeding 50 kilometers, that exceeded Western torpedoes of the era. The Type 93's design philosophy thus lived on in Soviet weapons long after the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist. More broadly, the Type 93 stands as an example of a recurring dynamic in military technology: the pursuit of marginal advantage through innovation, and the complex calculus of risk versus reward in weapons development. Japanese engineers achieved remarkable success in creating a torpedo with performance characteristics no Western Navy matched. The Type 93's range at high speed exceeded American torpedoes by factors of 3 to 4. Its weightless running made it far more difficult to detect and evade. Its large warhead gave it destructive power sufficient to cripple or sink major warships with a single hit. But they achieved this success by accepting risks that other navies had examined and rejected. The volatile nature of pure oxygen under pressure meant that manufacturing and handling required extreme care. A single mistake, contamination during production, improper maintenance procedures, damage to oxygen storage during combat, could result in catastrophic explosions. The complexity of oxygen generation systems meant that every ship carrying Type 93 torpedoes required specialized equipment and trained personnel to maintain it. The vulnerability of oxygen storage to battle damage created a weakness that became more dangerous as American firepower increased. For a brief period, when tactical conditions favored its use, the weapon fully justified those risks. In the night surface actions of late 1942, the Type 93 provided Japanese forces with a decisive advantage that translated directly into battlefield success. For Allied cruisers sunk at 29. Savo Island, 1 cruiser sunk and 3 crippled at Tassafaronga. These outcomes validated the years of research and development, the resources invested, the risks accepted. When conditions changed, when radar gave American forces the ability to fight effectively at night, when American airpower made large-scale surface engagements rare, when Japanese crew quality declined due to attrition, the risks remained but the advantages disappeared or diminished to the point of irrelevance. A weapon optimized for night surface combat at medium to long range became a liability when combat shifted to daylight engagements dominated by air power. The oxygen storage that enabled the weapon's performance became a vulnerability that endangered the ships carrying it. This pattern, a weapon that dominates under specific conditions but becomes obsolete when those conditions change, recurs throughout military history. The English longbow dominated European battlefields for more than a century, then disappeared within a generation when firearms and pike formations changed the nature of infantry combat. The battleship ruled the seas from 1900 to 1940, then became a vulnerable target once carrier aviation matured. The Type 93 torpedo fits this pattern, a revolutionary weapon that achieved extraordinary success within a narrow tactical window, then faded into obsolescence as the nature of warfare evolved. The story of the Long Lance is also a story about knowledge and secrecy, about the advantages of surprise and the challenges of maintaining technological security. Japan's decision to classify the Type 93 at the highest level, restricting knowledge even within the Imperial Japanese Navy to those with operational need to know meant that Allied intelligence had no warning of its existence before the war began. Western naval attaches in Japan, who routinely observed fleet exercises and reported on new ship construction, never detected the oxygen torpedo program. The installations at Kure Naval Arsenal where the 30 weapons were manufactured were closed to foreign visitors. Ships equipped with oxygen generation systems kept those installations concealed or disguised. The operational doctrine for employing the weapon was taught only to officers and crews of ships that would carry it. This security discipline paid enormous dividends. The weapon achieved near-complete surprise in its first combat use, a rare accomplishment in an era of increasingly sophisticated intelligence gathering. At Savo Island in August 1942, American commanders had no framework for understanding what had happened to their cruisers. They knew ships had been torpedoed, but the ranges seemed impossible, the damage seemed excessive, the lack of warning tracks in the water defied explanation. Only gradually, as intelligence personnel analyzed radio intercepts, interrogated prisoners, and examined salvaged torpedo components, did the truth emerge. But secrecy also had costs. It meant that when the war ended, Western knowledge of Japanese torpedo technology remained fragmentary and incomplete. Popular histories written in the late 1940s and 1950s sometimes exaggerated the Type 93's capabilities, describing it as a superweapon that could strike targets 20 miles away with perfect accuracy. Other accounts misunderstood its limitations, failing to recognize that the weapon was unguided and depended entirely on accurate initial firing solutions. The performance figures themselves were sometimes misreported, with sources conflating the different variants and speed settings. The name Longlance itself exemplifies this fragmented knowledge. It was an American creation, not the weapon's official designation. Japanese sources referred to it simply as the Type 93 torpedo, following the standard nomenclature that designated weapons by the year of adoption in the Japanese imperial calendar. American sailors and intelligence analysts, lacking this information and searching for a descriptive name, coined Longlance based on the weapon's extraordinary range. The 31 name stuck because it captured something essential about the torpedo: its reach, its lethality, the sense of threat it conveyed. But the fact that Western forces gave the weapon a name of their own devising reflects the success of Japanese security measures. Even after years of war, even after capturing numerous examples of the weapon, Allied forces did not know its proper designation. The human dimension of the Longlance's story deserves final mention. The torpedo killed more than 1,000 American, Australian, and other Allied sailors in the space of a few months. They died in sudden, violent fashion, ships exploding or capsizing in darkness, men trapped below decks or burned or drowned in water covered with flaming oil. For the survivors, the memory of those nights off Guadalcanal, the flash of explosions, the screams, the desperate struggle in the water, remained vivid for the rest of their lives. Veterans of Savo Island, Tassafaronga, and the other night battles spoke of the Longlance with a respect bordering on fear, the recognition that they had faced a weapon against which courage and training were insufficient protection. For the Japanese sailors who launched those torpedoes, the experience was different but no less intense. In the night actions of 1942, destroyer and cruiser crews executed their attacks with precision and discipline, following doctrine, maintaining formation under fire, launching torpedoes at calculated range and bearing. They witnessed the results: distant flashes, pillars of fire rising into the night, enemy ships dead in the water or sinking. They knew they had achieved something extraordinary, inflicted devastating losses on a superior force. But they also knew it could not last, that American strength was growing, that each successful engagement brought them closer to the moment when numerical and industrial superiority would overwhelm tactical skill. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Type 93 torpedo existed primarily in archives and intelligence reports, a weapon that had dominated night surface combat for barely a year before circumstances 32 rendered it increasingly obsolete. The destroyers and cruisers that had carried it were sunk or rusting at anchor, their oxygen generation systems silent, their torpedo tubes empty. The men who had trained for years to employ the weapon effectively were dead, or prisoners, or awaiting repatriation to a defeated nation. The tactical doctrine that had made the long lance so lethal, careful approach, silent running, maximum range launch, had been studied and countered and absorbed into American institutional knowledge. What remains is the record, a weapon that achieved what its designers intended, that performed to specifications under combat conditions, that altered the tactical balance in a critical theater for a critical period. The Type 93 did not change the war's outcome. Japan's strategic position, industrial base, and geographic vulnerabilities made defeat nearly inevitable once American industrial mobilization reached full capacity. But the long lance demonstrated that innovation and technical excellence could matter, that a nation with inferior resources could achieve local superiority through superior engineering and tactical doctrine. For 8 months in 1942 and early 1943, in the dark waters off Guadalcanal, that proposition held true. Japanese destroyers armed with Type 93 torpedoes dominated the night. American cruisers and destroyers learned through bitter experience that the enemy possessed weapons they had not anticipated and tactics they had not prepared to face. The torpedo's range, 22 nautical miles at moderate speed, 11 miles at high speed, remained unmatched by any Western weapon until the advent of guided missiles decades later. The absence of a visible weight gave it a stealth advantage that radar could not overcome. The 1,080-pound warhead was large enough to break a destroyer in half or cripple a cruiser with a single hit. These characteristics made the Type 93 a genuine technological achievement, a weapon that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. 33. Yet ultimately, the Long Lancer's story illustrates a fundamental truth about technology in warfare: superior weapons are necessary but insufficient. They must be employed within a tactical and operational framework that leverages their strengths and mitigates their weaknesses. They must be integrated into a broader strategy that accounts for the enemy's countermeasures and adaptations. And they must contribute to strategic objectives that are themselves realistic and achievable. Japan possessed the finest torpedo in the world, employed it with skill and courage, and still lost the war because torpedoes alone could not overcome the vast disparities in industrial capacity, resources, and strategic position that characterized the Pacific conflict. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world. 34.